When the war hero placed his Purple Heart on the pawnshop counter, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. The old ceiling fan continued turning lazily overhead, the clock on the wall continued ticking, and traffic still rolled past outside on the dusty streets of Amarillo, Texas. But inside that small pawn shop, nobody moved. Even the man behind the counter paused in the middle of writing a receipt. The metal lay beneath the afternoon sunlight streaming through the front window, its purple ribbon worn slightly from age, its bronze heart reflecting a faint golden glow. Every person in the room recognized it immediately. Some metals could be bought and sold. Some watches could be traded. Some guns could change owners a dozen times. But a Purple Heart was different. It represented blood spilled in service to the country. It represented pain, sacrifice, and memories most men carried to their graves. A few customers standing near the shelves exchanged uncomfortable glances. One elderly rancher slowly removed his hat. Nobody said a word because nobody knew what to say. The man who had placed the medal on the counter didn't look like someone trying to make a quick dollar. He looked like a man who had run out of options. His shoulders were broad but tired. His face was weathered beyond his years. His work shirt had been washed so many times that the color had nearly disappeared from the fabric. The scar that ran along the side of his neck vanished beneath his collar, but it remained visible enough to tell its own story. He wasn't looking at the pawnbroker. He wasn't looking at the customers. He was looking directly at the Purple Heart itself, as though trying to memorize it one last time before letting it go. And standing near a rack of saddles only a few feet away was another man who noticed everything. A tall man wearing a tan sport coat and a Stetson hat. He had entered the shop less than 10 minutes earlier, searching for a replacement holster for a ranch trip scheduled later that week. Until that moment, he had been browsing quietly without attracting attention. But the instant he saw the Purple Heart placed on the counter, he stopped moving. His name was John Wayne, and what happened inside that pawn shop on a windy afternoon in March of 1958 would stay with him for the rest of his life. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what age you are today. I always enjoy seeing how many different places around the world these stories reach. Now let's travel back to Amarillo, Texas, in the spring of 1958, where a decorated veteran was about to make the hardest decision of his entire life. March 1958 had arrived with little relief for the Texas Panhandle. Months without meaningful rain had turned pastures brown and brittle. Dust drifted across highways like smoke, cattle prices had weakened, and many small ranchers found themselves fighting a losing battle against debts that seemed to grow larger every week. 20 miles outside Amarillo stood a modest ranch that had once supported 3 generations of the Briggs family. The property wasn't large enough to make anyone wealthy, but for decades it had provided a decent living and a place to call home. Now it was hanging by a thread. Walter Briggs stood beside a broken fence line early that morning, watching the wind push dust across fields that should have been green. At 41 years old, he looked closer to 55. Years of ranch work combined with injuries suffered during the Korean War had taken their toll. Every cold morning brought pain to his left leg where shrapnel had torn through muscle years earlier. Some days the pain remained manageable. Other days it felt like a knife twisting behind his knee. Walter rarely complained. Men like him had been raised to endure hardship without talking about it. Yet even he could no longer ignore reality. 3 months behind on the mortgage, 2 months behind on feed payments, a truck that needed repairs, medical bills stacked on the kitchen table, and worst of all, his 10-year-old son Tommy had become seriously ill during the winter. The doctors believed he would recover, but treatment required money that simply didn't exist. Walter had already sold equipment, livestock, tools, and nearly everything of value that wasn't absolutely necessary. The ranch was beginning to resemble a place being slowly dismantled piece by piece. Every week another possession disappeared. Every week another bill arrived. Every week another promise was made to creditors, yet the numbers never improved. Inside the small ranch house, Sarah Briggs stood near the stove preparing breakfast while pretending not to worry. She had become an expert at pretending. She smiled when Tommy entered the room. She smiled when Walter returned from checking fences. She smiled whenever neighbors visited. But the smile rarely reached her eyes anymore. She knew exactly how serious the situation had become because she was the one balancing every dollar that entered or left the household. She was the one deciding which bills could wait and which could not. She was the one quietly skipping meals some evenings so Tommy could have larger portions without realizing why. That morning, she watched Walter enter through the back door, carrying another letter from the bank. Neither of them needed to open it to know what it contained. The final warnings always sounded polite, but the message never changed. Pay immediately or face foreclosure. Walter placed the envelope beside three others already resting on the table. For several moments, nobody spoke. Tommy sat nearby, drawing pictures of horses while humming softly to himself, completely unaware of how close his family stood to losing everything. Finally, Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Walter's hand. The gesture lasted only a second, but it said more than words could. Walter nodded and looked toward the window. In that moment, he made a decision he had spent months avoiding. There remained one possession he had sworn never to part with. One item he had protected through every hardship since Korea. One object carrying memories too painful and too important to measure in dollars. Yet desperate men eventually arrive at places they never imagined visiting. Walter rose from the table, walked into the bedroom, and opened a small wooden box hidden in the back of a closet. Inside rested several photographs, a folded American flag, and a Purple Heart awarded after he carried two wounded soldiers to safety while under enemy fire near Heartbreak Ridge. The medal wasn't merely metal and ribbon. It represented friends who never came home. It represented fear, courage, sacrifice, and survival. For years, Walter had told himself he would die before selling it. Yet as he stared at Tommy through the doorway, listening to his son cough lightly while coloring at the kitchen table, the choice suddenly became clear. Some promises mattered more than others. Keeping his family together mattered more. Saving his son's future mattered more. Slowly, he picked up the Purple Heart, placed it into his pocket, grabbed his truck keys, and headed toward Amarillo without telling Sarah where he was going. The drive into town took nearly 40 minutes. Walter spent most of it staring through the windshield while memories surfaced one after another. Korea, snow-covered hills, artillery fire, the faces of men he hadn't seen in years, the military hospital where doctors removed fragments of steel from his leg, the ceremony where a commanding officer handed him the medal and thanked him for his service. By the time he parked outside the pawn shop on Polk Street, his hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Several times he considered starting the engine and driving away. Several times he nearly changed his mind. But each time he thought about turning around, he remembered the unpaid medical bills waiting at home and the foreclosure notices sitting on the kitchen table. Finally, he stepped out of the truck and walked toward the front door. What he didn't know was that another customer had entered the shop only minutes earlier. A customer who would soon notice the Purple Heart, recognize exactly what it meant, and decide that some stories deserved a second look. John Wayne had no idea when he walked into that pawn shop that morning that before the week was over, he would find himself following a stranger down a dusty Texas street, uncovering a story that would test everything he believed about honor, sacrifice, and what one man owes another. Walter pushed open the pawn shop door and was greeted by the familiar sound of a small brass bell hanging above the entrance. The shop smelled of old leather, machine oil, and dust that had settled over decades of business. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with rifles, pocket watches, saddles, tools, and forgotten pieces of other people's hard times. Every item inside the building carried a story, but few carried the weight of the object resting in Walter Briggs's pocket. For several moments, he simply stood there pretending to examine a display of hunting knives while gathering the courage to walk toward the counter. Behind the register stood Hank Mercer, a 60-year-old pawnbroker who had spent most of his life buying and selling things people wished they didn't have to part with. Hank wasn't a cruel man. In fact, many people considered him fair. But business was business, and hard times had taught him not to become emotionally attached to transactions. Across the room, near a display of Western holsters, John Wayne quietly examined a leather belt while occasionally glancing toward the veteran who had just entered. Something about Walter immediately caught his attention. Perhaps it was the limp, perhaps it was the look on his face, or perhaps it was the way he kept touching his shirt pocket as though reassuring himself that something important was still there. Whatever the reason, Wayne found himself watching. Eventually, Walter reached the counter and removed a small cloth pouch from his pocket. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost reluctant. When he emptied the contents onto the glass countertop, the entire room seemed to freeze. The Purple Heart landed with a soft metallic sound that echoed louder than it should have. Hank Mercer stared at it. The customers stared at it. John Wayne stared at it. Nobody needed an explanation. Everyone knew exactly what they were looking at. For several long seconds, there was only silence. Hank removed his glasses and studied the metal carefully. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Walter didn't answer immediately. His eyes never left the Purple Heart. "Not really," he admitted. The honesty in his voice made several customers look away. Hank nodded slowly. He had seen desperation before, but this felt different. Most people sold possessions because they wanted money. Walter was selling a piece of himself because he believed he had no choice. "Need a loan?" Hank asked. Walter shook his head. "No. Need cash." Hank understood what that meant. Loans implied hope. Loans implied the possibility of returning later and reclaiming what had been left behind. Cash sales meant finality. Walter wasn't expecting to come back. Hank examined the metal again before naming a number. It wasn't insulting. It wasn't unfair. Yet everyone in the room knew it was nowhere near the true value of what lay on the counter. Some things simply couldn't be measured in dollars. Walter looked down at the metal and closed his eyes briefly. Memories rushed through him once again. The battlefield. The wounded men he had carried. The friends who never returned home. The officer who pinned the medal to his uniform while thanking him for bravery under fire. Every memory seemed determined to stop him from letting go. Then he thought about Tommy. The medicine. The bank notices. The ranch. Slowly he nodded. "I'll take it." Hank hesitated. He genuinely hoped the veteran might change his mind. When Walter didn't, the pawnbroker opened the cash drawer and began counting bills onto the counter. The sound of each note landing on the glass felt strangely painful. John Wayne watched the entire exchange without saying a word, but inside, something was bothering him. He had spent years meeting veterans, ranchers, working families, and people who quietly carried burdens nobody else saw. He knew pride when he saw it. Walter Briggs wasn't a man looking for sympathy. He wasn't looking for charity. He wasn't even asking for help. Yet there was something profoundly wrong about seeing a decorated veteran forced into a position where selling a Purple Heart seemed like his only remaining option. A few minutes later, Walter folded the cash carefully, signed the paperwork, and slipped the money into his wallet. Then he reached toward the Purple Heart one final time. His fingers touched the ribbon gently before pulling away. The gesture lasted less than a second, but everyone noticed it. It felt almost like a goodbye. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. The bell above the door rang softly as he disappeared into the bright Texas sunlight. For a moment, nobody moved. Then conversation slowly resumed around the shop. One customer shook his head. Another muttered something under his breath about how things weren't supposed to be this way. Hank Mercer placed the Purple Heart carefully inside a drawer beneath the counter rather than displaying it for sale. He wasn't entirely sure why. It simply felt wrong to treat it like ordinary merchandise. Meanwhile, John Wayne remained standing beside the holster display. He looked toward the door, then toward the counter, then back toward the door again. Something about Walter's face lingered in his mind. The veteran hadn't looked defeated. He had looked resigned, as though he had spent months fighting a battle nobody else could see and had finally run out of ammunition. Wayne walked slowly toward the counter. "You know him?" he asked. Hank nodded. "Walter Briggs, Korean War veteran, lives outside town." Wayne glanced toward the drawer holding the Purple Heart. "Good man?" Hank gave a short laugh. "About the best you'll find." Wayne remained silent. "Then why's he selling that?" Hank leaned against the counter and lowered his voice. "Depends who you ask. Drought hit his ranch hard. Heard the bank's circling. Heard his boy's been sick. Heard he's sold about everything else already." Wayne looked toward the window. Outside, Walter's old pickup was pulling away from the curb. Dust rose behind the tires as the truck disappeared down the street. For several seconds, Wayne watched it go. Then he reached for his hat. The decision came so naturally that he barely thought about it. Some people walk away from stories because they aren't their responsibility. Others find themselves unable to ignore them. John Wayne belonged to the second group. Without another word, he paid for the holster he had originally come to buy, tucked the package beneath his arm, and stepped outside into the afternoon sun. The wind carried dust across the street as traffic moved lazily through downtown Amarillo. Walter's pickup had already turned the corner and was heading south. Wayne watched it disappear into the distance. Most people would have returned to their own lives. Most people would have assumed the veteran's problems were his own business. Yet the image of that Purple Heart resting on the glass counter refused to leave Wayne's mind. A man doesn't sell something like that unless life has pushed him into a corner. And if life had pushed Walter Briggs that far, Wayne wanted to know why. He adjusted his Stetson, climbed into his truck, and started the engine. By the time he pulled onto the road, he had no plan, no speech prepared, and no idea where the story would lead. He only knew one thing. Somewhere ahead of him was a war hero who had just sold the most meaningful possession he owned. And before this week was over, John Wayne intended to find out exactly what had forced him to do it. Before we continue, type honor in the comments if you believe sacrifices made by veterans should never be forgotten. Because what John Wayne was about to discover at the Briggs Ranch would reveal a situation far worse than he had imagined, and it would change everything that happened next. The Briggs Ranch was even worse than John Wayne had imagined. The closer he drove, the more obvious the situation became. Fence posts leaned at odd angles. Empty cattle pens sat abandoned beneath layers of dust. Equipment that should have been working the fields stood idle beside weathered sheds. When Wayne finally parked near the ranch house, he remained inside his truck for several moments, simply observing. This wasn't a family suffering from temporary bad luck. This was a family standing at the edge of losing everything. He watched Walter carry a small paper bag from the truck into the house. The veteran moved carefully, favoring his injured leg. Through a kitchen window, Wayne could see a woman embracing him before taking the bag from his hands. Then a young boy appeared, smiling for the first time all day at the sight of medicine Walter had purchased with the money from the Purple Heart. Wayne immediately understood where the cash had gone. Not whiskey, not gambling, not poor decisions. Medicine. A father had sold his most treasured possession so his son could receive treatment. Suddenly, the story felt even heavier than before. Wayne remained parked on the road for another minute before quietly turning the truck around and driving away. He wasn't interested in embarrassing Walter by appearing uninvited, but now he knew enough to continue digging. The following morning, Wayne visited the county courthouse. A few conversations later, the situation became painfully clear. The Briggs Ranch was less than 2 weeks away from foreclosure. Years of drought had destroyed production. Feed bills had accumulated. Medical expenses had pushed the family beyond recovery. The bank had already prepared paperwork to begin taking possession of the property. By lunchtime, Wayne had learned something else. Walter Briggs wasn't merely respected because he had served in Korea. He was respected because of the way he lived afterward. Every person Wayne spoke with described the veteran the same way. Honest, reliable, proud. The kind of man who would repair a neighbor's fence before fixing his own. The kind of man who never asked for favors. The kind of man who quietly helped others while refusing help himself. One elderly shopkeeper finally summed it up best. If Walter Briggs is in trouble, he said, then trouble found the wrong man. That sentence stayed with Wayne the rest of the afternoon. By evening, he had made up his mind. The next morning, John Wayne returned to Hank Mercer's pawn shop. The old broker looked surprised to see him again. Without saying much, Wayne pointed toward the drawer beneath the counter. Hank already knew why he had come. He removed the Purple Heart carefully and placed it on the glass. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Wayne picked up the metal and studied it beneath the sunlight. "How much?" he asked. Hank named the amount Walter had received. Wayne shook his head and placed several additional bills on the counter. Hank frowned. "That's too much." Wayne smiled slightly. "Not for this." The pawnbroker looked at the metal once more before accepting the money. As Wayne slipped the Purple Heart into his pocket, he wasn't thinking about its value. He was thinking about the man who had been forced to let it go. But buying the metal back was only the beginning. The real problem wasn't resting inside his pocket. The real problem sat 20 miles away on a struggling ranch where a family was preparing to lose everything they had built over generations. 3 days later, the foreclosure auction arrived. Neighbors gathered quietly around the Briggs Ranch while bank representatives prepared paperwork. Walter stood beside Sarah and Tommy, trying to remain strong despite knowing the outcome seemed inevitable. Then the sound of an approaching truck echoed across the property. Heads turned. Dust rose from the road. And moments later, John Wayne stepped out wearing a tan jacket and carrying a small wooden box beneath one arm. Nobody understood why he was there. Walter certainly didn't. In fact, the veteran looked genuinely confused as Wayne approached him. Without speaking, Wayne handed him the wooden box. Walter opened it slowly. The moment he saw the Purple Heart resting inside, his eyes widened. For several seconds, he couldn't breathe. Neither could Sarah. The medal he believed was gone forever sat directly in front of him. Before Walter could say a word, Wayne handed him a second envelope. Inside were documents showing that the overdue mortgage, medical bills, and feed debt had been paid in full. The foreclosure was canceled. The ranch belonged to the Briggs family once again. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. Tommy hugged his father. Walter simply stared at the papers in disbelief. Finally, he looked up at Wayne. Why? The answer came quietly. Because a man shouldn't have to sell his honor just to save his family. Years later, visitors entering the local Veterans Museum in Amarillo would stop in front of a small display case containing a Purple Heart, several photographs, and a plaque. The plaque didn't talk about Hollywood. It didn't mention movies. It simply read, "Return to Walter Briggs by John Wayne, 1958. And perhaps that was fitting, because the story was never really about John Wayne. It was about a father willing to sacrifice everything for his family, and about a reminder that true honor isn't found in medals alone. It's found in the people who earn them. If you enjoyed this story, type "Honor Never for Sale" in the comments along with your location, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable John Wayne stories.